Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence, it's hard to disentangle them sometimes. There's climatic, geopolitical. In the United States, there's domestic political transition going on that's going to be monumental in so many ways and with deep uncertainty, which is going to be a topic today in the climate context. Um, so here we go with another Sustain What episode. What I try to do in these conversations is provide some sense of trajectory and pathways through turbulence when consequential discussions, especially relate to science, especially relate to sustainability. And I was really excited to see this paper come out in Nature Climate Change just a week or so ago. Tipping points confuse and can distract from urgent climate action. You know, we've all in the media environment, we pay attention, the media especially pay attention to dramatic claims and assertions and conclusions. And tipping points through the last couple of decades, that whole concept has built a big head of steam. I think Michael Oppenheimer is joining in too now, and there'll be others popping in from this paper. I'm Andy Revkin, and I have several of the authors of this new paper coming on here. And we'll have a discussion from their various vantage points of the ideas in the paper, and hopefully we'll answer some questions for people who are watching live, because that's the great merit of this particular platform and Sustain What. And I wanted to dive in quickly because there's lots to go over. This is not just about ice sheets; it's about social tipping points as well. The paper, what I love about this paper, along with the fact that it's raising important questions, is that it's bringing in, it's getting the multiple dimensions of what we think about with tipping points. And this is what I call, tipping point is on my list of what I call watchwords, which are terms, phrases that confuse, too often confuse or divide more than they clarify. And unless you start defining them, you end up, what's that worth, really, if you're just throwing them around in a headline? So again, I'm glad to have this here. So let's just go right at this. Here in Maine, where I live, we were walking down an old rail trail one day, and this sign was there, which I think is appropriate. The sign had flipped over as maybe the nail got rusty, and now we're in an environment where caution is clearly important, where uncertainty is still deeply in the mix on the things that really matter about climate, the pace of sea level rise. Many things. How whether Africa will get wetter or drier near the equator in a warming climate. That's still kind of in the mix of things that are uncertain. So let's start with Robert Kopp, and Rachael. How do you pronounce your last name? Shwom.
Yep.
You're both from Rutgers, and Michael Oppenheimer here is from Princeton, who I had on recently on an earlier conversation about this issue.
Right.
We'll start with Bob. You're the lead author. Just start with how this came together. It's a paper with, there's a journalism professor, there's a sociologist, Rachael, and others, and some hard, focused physical climate sciences. So what made you feel this had to be written out?
Yeah, so Rachel and I have been working together on physical and social tipping points for close to a decade. So we had a paper together back in 2016. And at the time, we made the point, we were not saying at that point, don't talk about tipping points. What we're saying is there's the way the tipping point framing is set up seems like it's likely to cause confusion in that, well, some tipping points, take thousands of years from when you cross a threshold to when you see the change. Most people, when they hear the term tipping points, don't think of a big, slow-moving process. They think of changes that are rapid on time scales that are rapid to them. And so at the time we said, okay, well, we've got to be more careful about that. And also at the time we said, well, and if we think about the things that are likely to be impactful to people in the near term, maybe we should be more concerned about how, say, repeated extensive extreme events stress social systems. And that might be a more likely path to impact of substantial scale in the next decades than a physical tipping point. So that's where we were in 2016.
Yeah.
Since then, we've seen a lot continued growth of the tipping points literature on both sort of the physical side and there started to be, I don't think we can claim responsibility for this because there was a lot in the air at the time, but there was a lot more work on social tipping points. And you think that hasn't gotten clearer. Right at this point, right. There's a global tipping points report led out of University of Exeter last year, right? And what was in that report spanned from like these classic so-called tipping points of things like ocean circulation collapse and ice sheet collapse, to technology learning curves, to loss of social norms, to changes in food waste.
Right.
And, we started with the premise, okay, that people have been at this for 20 years. At some point, we have to say is what this phrase means is what people do with it, right? You might try to make it so precise that you can say, this is specifically what it means. But just last year, Liz pointed out to me, there was a Guardian article about a different sort of tipping points. And Tim Linton, who's one of the people established this within the article, saying, well, I don't think that, this isn't the definition of tipping point I'm promoting. That's okay.
Right.
But we've been trying to clarify this for a long time. It hasn't worked. And we have to
there's
look
a utility question.
There's a, well, I would say
definition of.
There's a utility question and there's a clarity question. And then there are some things like built into tipping point, right? Well, if something's a tipping point, it should be a point, which means it has 0 dimensions. It's not a range. It's not a zone of increased risk, right? Even if you don't know where it is, there is a point. You will cross that point and you'll commit to change. But if you look even at like the classic or one of the classic tipping points, like ocean circulation change, our colleagues at GISS, as Goddard Institute for Space Studies, did a simulation a year ago where they ran exactly the same moderate emission scenario for 500 years, 10 times. And then 2 out of 10 times, you got a collapse of the Atlantic Meridian overturning circulation. And 8 of the 10, you don't, which suggests, well, there's not a single, in a given emissions pathway, in a given temperature pathway, there's not a temperature indexed point of no return that you can clearly identify, even in retrospect. Like
so that's one of the definitional issues.
There's a set of definitional concerns we raise. There's a set of concerns we raise about the fact that, well, originally this framing was adopted with the idea of spurring attention and action, and Rachael and Liz can talk more to the social science there, but the social science basically suggests, well, it's not very well structured to spur action. And then there's the sort of way to say is there harm to doing this? And I think like the amount of confusion we see about particularly the 1.5 degrees C target and a physical property of the Earth system suggests that, people are getting confused. Many people think 1.5 degrees C is a tipping point, and that can lead to rash action to avoid it. Solar radiation management just to keep below that strict threshold. It can lead to despair. Some people are deciding not to have kids because of climate change, and I think a good chunk of them think there is some cliff the world is going to fall over in their lifetime. And it can also lead to loss of credibility because we are going to pass 1.5 degrees, and the world is not going to be dramatically different at 1.55 degrees.
Right.
And so I think all of this are risks to the framing, and I think our fundamental attitude is, well, as researchers operating in this world, we sort of have to accept that the framing means what the framing means what the framing is interpreted to mean. And if we, after 20 years, we don't like that and we think it's being misconstrued, we might have to say, well, maybe there's something wrong with the framing.
And yet it's so seductive to have that distilled thing, that badge, that headline. Mm-hmm. So let's go, before we get into more depth, let's go around the circle here. And Rachael, we did mention you're at Rutgers as well. You're a sociologist. You've teamed up with Bob on this kind of analysis. So what led you into this realm? It is kind of a hot, heated issue, as it has been since a long time. Gavin Schmidt wrote about this in 2006. So Rachael, what prompted you to dive in here? And tell us a little bit about your perspective. What does a sociologist bring to this question?
Yeah, I mean, my entree was I've been looking at how societies are responding to climate change, right? So I'm interested in social change in response to climate change, how we make sense of this problem, how we decide to act upon this problem. And so so I was coming at it from a social change perspective and thinking about it as, okay, how does rapid social change happen? And so that first paper we were talking about, I was thinking a lot about the mechanisms of how kind of fast social change happens when it seems to happen very quickly. And, talking about when there are positive feedbacks and kind of diffusion of ideas quickly. Or the idea that we all have one kind of rule for action or norm that we all hold, and it's triggered by changing conditions, right? And that we can get a lot of social change that way. But over time, as I was, thinking about this more and more and seeing the kind of discourse, both in the media and in research, evolve, I began to really see, social tipping points as just being not an accurate view of social change, because even kind of those conditions as they change, or those kind of diffusion processes, there's always kind of all kinds of other social and political and economic factors involved in that. And so to me, the idea of, oh, it just happened, really quickly was often kind of ahistorical and not a good capturing or way to think about social change as well. And so I started to have also the idea that we couldn't really, all the time we were like, oh, is this a social tipping point? Some change would happen. But then you can only kind of tell looking backwards, right, retrospectively. Right. And so I just came to kind of have around uncertainty and whether we're on the social side of prediction and the social sciences. And so I became more skeptical that this is a really useful way to study social change and even rapid social change, and also thinking about the communication aspects of it.
Sorry about the dog. And Elisabeth Gilmore, you're at Carleton College, and you're in the civil and environmental engineering, but you're very much into sort of technology policy as well, if I have this correct. So, what drew you into this arena, and what does your skill set tell you as I don't know whether there's been feedback already on the paper, but what pulled you in, and what did you bring to this?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, just a quick correction. I'm at Carleton University.
Oh my gosh.
That's okay. I'm
looking right at it. Carleton University, Ottawa. Yeah.
It occurs a lot.
Is there a Carleton College somewhere? I think there
is.
Minnesota.
Yep. But Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada.
Thank you.
And I came into this, as you mentioned, sort of a bit as an engineer, but actually also from the policy standpoint, right? So we've got this concept, and we're starting to ask, like, what is this doing for us, right? So, on one hand, people are like, no, this is a physical, real thing. And you start to ask around, and, at first, it seems as if that, that we're talking about, things that we absolutely must avoid, right? And then you start to see, as Rachael said, right, the term starts to be about, these features, and you start to say, are we really just bringing this into being? And then it became even larger, right? Then this was these more sort of positive scenarios, right? Now we want to have tipping points. And I think, from a policy perspective, you have to kind of take a step back and ask, what does this framing mean within a policy space, right? So if you think about, these tipping points, and you say, well, we absolutely have to avoid them, then, we sort of explore that in the paper, and we say, well, would that mean that we would do just about anything if we thought we were getting to one? And, do we know that with enough certainty? What would that mean for the types of actions that we would take? And I think when you start to distill it in that way, you kind of lose some of the, even sort of the physical reality of it, right? 1.49 is certainly not good, and 1.5 is definitely worse. But what if we're at 1.55, right? What does that imply for the types of actions? And it could lead us into a situation where we may be unleashing actions that are not commensurate with the risks that we actually face. So the framing itself could be very problematic. But similarly, as Rachael said, right, the idea that we have these positive social tipping points may also lead us to underestimate the challenges that we face, but also miss some of the aspects of agency and of transformation that we also need.
Yeah.
And so that was really where I think we all sort of were trying to tackle some of the concerns with the framing, and then really kind of came together to ask, does this make sense?
Yeah, and Michael, you and I discussed this some months ago.
Right.
You and I go way, way back to the days of nuclear winter and the early days of global warming. You've had a career that's spanned campaigns, basic science, and the policy interface with science. And so I guess maybe from you briefly, your sense of, well, one thing that we talked about, I think that's important, is also what's called opportunity cost by economists. The field of climate science, if people are working too hard on this fundamental and very complicated question about tipping points, what are they not working on that's more useful to society right now? So that came up earlier, but what you've been looking at this through this week or two, and the paper's out, and you were just at AGU. So what do you feel the key takeaway is here, and is it resonating?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of takeaways, and I agree with what's been said so far. One particular aspect of it that's concerned me for a long time, and I want to say, by the way, I was part of the original expert elicitation that Tim Lenton put together on tipping points. This is not something that I was opposed to as a framing from the beginning, but gradually, as has Bob, I got uncomfortable with it. But give you a specific example, during the 5th IPCC assessment, I was a coordinating lead author on the chapter that has to assemble all the information about the Working Group 2 chapter, about all the impacts of climate change and what to do about them, adaptation. And in the process, we were also responsible for the well-known burning embers diagram,
Right,
which classifies everything in terms of 5 types of impacts or risks, and tries to, provides a backup, the scientific backup for which is used sometimes to justify the 1.5 or 2 degree target. And in the process of that, we had to sort of describe the level of risk for loss of a significant part of either the Antarctic, in particular the West Antarctic ice sheet, or the Greenland ice sheet. And so we did a lot of thinking about the timescales, and it's not just a matter of something happening, and that's it. Humans have the ability to adapt. And in that context, there's a huge difference between something that could happen in the course of 10, 50, maybe 100 years, which
right,
is at least somewhat close to the notion of tipping. There are the burning embers. And I'm talking about the 5th ember now, the one on the far right in each of these
right.
2 cases, and something that happens rather more slowly. And in case of the Greenland ice sheet, the fastest assessment of how rapidly you could lose most of the ice was a millennium or more.
Right.
And there's a world of difference between the ability of humans to adjust to something, which in the case of parts of Antarctica could be, or at least was thought at that time, could be as short as maybe a century, and
Right.
to have a millennium to do so. And at that point, where it became necessary to put a number on it in terms of how big the risk is, I just, jumped off the tipping point ship, basically. I just thought it was wrong. And the final assessment, which is the opinion of all the authors on the chapter and then all the authors on all the other chapters, essentially, it was that the Greenland risk is simply not as large as the Antarctic risk, because you have to think that humans are not going to just sit there if something like this starts to happen. They're going to have some time to adapt. It doesn't mean it's a good thing. It doesn't even mean it's necessarily a better thing. It just means that the risk in terms of what humans can do about it and to reduce the harm, you have to think about that. And expressing all that as a tipping point made no sense to me. And
Right.
if from there, I was open to the idea of abandoning it. And frankly, after seeing the incredible expansion of the literature, which uses the term tipping point,
Right.
and realizing there's a lot of faults, as Bob said, with the way it's used, just scientifically speaking, the enthusiasm I might have originally had drained away, and I thought we need to do better. It doesn't mean that all uses of the term tipping point are wrong or misleading or unwise scientifically or as a communication tool, but it does mean that it's way, way overused.
Yeah, and here you can see that surge in the literature. I don't think there's a tipping point in the use of the word tipping points. It seemed like a positive. I think there was a lot of positive feedbacks involved here, more than tipping elements, and that the media being part of the positive feedback.
Yeah, but it's not just the media. It strikes me, maybe I'm sensitized to it, but if you read titles of scientific articles, it's unbelievable how commonly the term is used. And that alone should be a concern. It's an indicator that it's applied much too widely, in my view. It's a simple way to see that.
So circling back to Bob, your paper basically seems to be a call for much more clarity, defining terms, not for rejecting necessarily this term, but definitely describing the different flavors. It reminds me a lot of, this reminds me so much of the discussion around planetary boundaries as well, I have to say.
Again, before we get to the recommendations, like a couple other thoughts that didn't quite come up in the go round. So one, relating to the utility of the concept. So Rachael and I a few years ago wrote a review article that looked over a range of social scientific theories on when societies act and advance to manage accumulating long-term risks. And the tipping point framing was very explicitly introduced, and this in and of itself is a little unusual, but it was very explicitly introduced with some degree of political motivation or marketing motivation, right? The very early paper said, had this idea, well, we need a positive social tipping point to avoid catastrophic climate tipping points, right? So Tim Linton and Hans Schallenhuber said that in a 2007 review or comment that was one of the first major papers on this. So then that leads the question, right? I mean, so we put aside whether that's a good way of coming up with a framing. If that's the if that's the goal, one ought to ask: is this a good way of achieving that goal? And if you look at this paper, I think this is the preprint version of it. It was published in 2019, but you probably don't have access to the published version, right? There are a bunch of theories that say when acting is more likely. For instance, social psychology suggests that people are more likely to act on risks that are relatively certain and relatively proximal in space and time. And here you're trying to motivate risk with this deeply uncertain, global, vague in time Earth system tipping points. Focusing event theory says that policy change in democracies is more likely when you have an event, a focusing event that draws people's attention to an issue where there's a policy community that has remedies available. And we're sort of failing on both points here. One, we actually are not lacking at this point for focusing events for climate change, which in and of itself should tell you, well, we don't need to create more focusing events. We're just for some reason, the focusing events we're having, as you can see every day when you open the newspaper, are not enough to spur action commensurate to the scale of the problem. But two, for climate tipping points, we're not going to turn on the TV one day and see, the West Antarctic ice sheet is collapsing, or AMOC is collapsing, right? These are processes that are long, slow down, and require analysis and take place over a long time, and are, if they happen, are identified in retrospect. So they're not well suited to create focusing events. If you think there are actions that should be taken to manage the risks associated with something like overturning circulation collapse, the opportunities to do that are more likely to happen in the context of processes to address adaptation more broadly than some particular tipping point issue. And in terms of policy remedies, other than we should mitigate more, which we should for many reasons. There's the tipping points research community hasn't put a lot of tipping point specific solutions on the table. But many people have taken this because of this 1.5 degree confusion also has a call to, we better look into solar geoengineering because there's this arbitrary target that we think has some physical significance that we better stage precisely behind. So there's, so from a utility perspective, I don't think it's doing very well. And then there's also, I guess in terms of clarity perspective, I have the opinion, I don't know if all my authors share that researchers do have some responsibility for the consequences of how they choose to communicate their research. And you could say, well, let's imagine the thought experiment where instead of calling these tipping points, we call them feedback-driven state shifts, right? Feedback-driven state shifts is a pretty good characterization of what most of the tipping point community means by tipping points. But you're not going to have a lot of headlines blaring, Earth committed to feedback-driven state shift, right? So the difference between the two is the marketing import. And so then you're going to say, well, you've got to pay attention to what other ideas are brought with that distinction between how people perceive the term feedback-driven state shift and how people perceive the term tipping point. I said on Blue Sky a day or two ago, right? You can think of the analogy of artificial intelligence versus very large regression, right? Basically the same thing, but you're not going to have people, worrying about existential risk to society from very large scale regression analysis. So you need to, I don't think you can just wash your hands by saying, okay, well, we're going to define this term very precisely and then not care about its perception.
By the way, to back that up, Scott Barrett, who's a political scientist at Columbia, you may know him, has done a series of experiments with Astrid Dannenberg, and they published this work where they're essentially experiments with volunteers. It's a game of how they would act, basically collectively, in a situation where there's a threat. And if you get a threat that looks essentially as a tipping point, people, first of all, people do very little about threats until they're imminent. And if they're big enough, they eventually want to do something about it, but almost always by that time it's too late. Of course, what too late means is a whole other discussion. And they therefore do nothing. And he's gotten this result repeatedly in a whole lot of forums where, betting money is an issue. So you tie it to something real that people can understand. And the result seems, to him at least, fairly robust. And this is someone who'd written a whole series of papers before he started doing the experiments, which used tipping points as the exemplar of how to think about the strategic game that countries play with the climate problem.
Boy, well, you're describing a pretty wicked situation. There was that paper I loved 10 years or so ago from Kelly Levin and others on the super wicked nature of the climate problem. And unfortunately, the media don't write about things that are super wicked. And campaigners and institutions, even the Secretary General of the UN, like to distill things. I want to show you something. Bob, in your Blue Sky threads, which were great on this, you pointed to Davos, the World Economic Forum, had posted a ridiculously false piece about the 1.5 degrees threshold being science, not literally being science. It blew my mind. I hadn't seen that, and I was kind of startled. I guess that gets us still into this arena of messaging and institutions with influence. How much?
I,
Who should be reading the paper? I guess is the
well,
question.
I think
Here it is for everyone to look. 1.5C is a physical limit. Here is why this target can't be negotiated. This is the World Economic Forum. This is where everyone flies there in their jets. And so what the heck's up?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, the thing that pushed me over the edge into writing this paper was keeping seeing this phase 1.5 degree tipping point, right, which is a clear confusion, and like a lot of that I think is due to the media, but I don't think scientists can claim they're not responsible as well. I mean, there was a very nice overall review of the state of the so-called tipping points literature a couple of years ago, led by David Armstrong McKay. But in their headline, it was either in Science or Nature, right? So they go for this flashy title, and it was something about crossing 1.5 degrees C commits planet to multiple tipping points. But if you look at their analysis, it's like, oh, well, between 1 degree and 2 or more degrees, you see increasing risk of a bunch of tipping points. All of the ones, or almost all the ones that they label as potentially being crossed at 1.5 degrees C also could have been crossed at 1 degree C in their paper, right? But that doesn't lend itself to a focus on this 1.5 degree threshold as being specifically physically grounded. So I want to say just on specific things that we recommend. Well, we do suggest caution. I mean, if I had my druthers, people would stop using the frame. But to the extent that people continue to use it, I think we have to recognize that it's a communications choice. There are people who study communications and its impacts, and decisions about how to communicate should be informed by scholarly work on the implications of different ways of communicating, and not simply on the intuition of climate scientists like me about how people might conceive different terms, right? If you're going to select a term for its communications, well, Andy, you know a lot more about this than I do, but that there are people who spend a lot of money to understand what the implications of different ways of communicating are. And there's scholars who study this, and these questions of what sort of perceptions the term tipping points creates in people's minds and the minds of policymakers compared to the phrase, feedback-driven state shift, I think is important to understand. Now, personally, I think most of the things on the physical side under this banner also share another set of traits together, which is that we can't model them very well. They're of unknown likelihood, but potentially high impact. So if you were being technical, you could just label them as unknown likelihood, high impact outcomes. But you can also use phrases like potential surprises. And from a risk perspective, it's really important to think about potential surprises. Like all of the things under this banner are important to study. But most of them are important to study because they could have high impact, and we don't know how likely they are. And that in and of itself is the reason to study them, not because of the particulars of the system dynamic feedbacks that may or may not underlie their mechanisms. So that's like use scholarship on communication rather than just intuition. Use clearer terms that get more at why they're actually important, like unknown likelihood, high impact, or potential surprises. There's a lot of important work to do on understanding societal changes. Tipping points probably doesn't actually capture very well. I think it's critical to be clear about this point that 1.5 degrees C is a negotiated policy target, not a physical property of physical limit of the Earth system.
I'd love to hear from a couple more of you on this grand question of sort of who is this paper ideally ingested by, and I mean really ingested, not just, or is it being resisted? And
the scientific. I've spoken to a lot of the people who are, if there are two sides on the other side of this, since the paper got into draft form, and I collaborate with some of them, and I've known others for decades, and many of them, I've never done a head count, but many of them are seriously uncomfortable with what they've created, in the sense that they know that this has to that they've been sloppy. Some of them, I don't want to, again, I don't want to provide a head count. Some of them have been sloppy. Some of the papers are sloppy in failing to notice these subtleties and be explicit about them. So they got trapped in a way by the glamour of the term, and just the scientific aspects are yet to catch up, in the sense they've just now, I think a lot of them starting to think, oh yeah, we have a lot of hard work to do to show that this isn't a very good reflection of what actually goes on, if we're going to use the term, to being much more specific about it. And that's a good thing. These are smart people. These are well-intended people. And I'm sure that over time, the term isn't going to disappear, but they will use it much more carefully in the future. That's what I expect. Now, there's a separate issue, which is the public communication issue, which none of these people were ever experts in and still aren't. And so, that community, and we've got two of them here, but we need a lot more people from that community trying to help the scientific community learn how to speak in the public arena.
Some more papers.
Yeah, and if I can jump.
Yeah.
I can jump in. I was going to say, I hope that some social scientists read this, or communication researchers, and say like, oh, I can do some research on that, because we scoured pretty hard for research that's been done. And, there's a 2023, I think, paper by Bellamy that, had done a survey of public perceptions of tipping point. And I found that when it was used, people felt more depressed, less belief in efficacy to address less belief in ability to address climate change. And, but there's a lot more research around the term, but even more research on how, to effectively communicate. How do we communicate that these changes aren't linear, right? Or potential surprises? What are the effective terms? There's a lot of research to be done there to find solutions to guide scientists, I think. And so I really, and beyond that, also just social scientists to help think about the social change process. There's this literature on positive social tipping points, but, thinking about on how social change happens, the really complex ways that it occurs, and the factors that are involved, to kind of help advance that conversation too. So I think there's a lot. I hope social scientists see this and think about a call to research.
Well, I certainly hope so too. In the paper you had mentioned you collaborated on a couple of years ago, Bob and Rachael, I think. When you looked at, I think you were talking about looking at social tipping points. I'm already not remembering correctly, probably. But are there examples that illustrate why climate and energy don't fit what you see when you look back? The one thing that comes to mind for me is certainly in democracies is there's no we, there's no single audience. There's a divergent sense of what the crisis is when we look at issues like the ones we're talking about here. And I could show you two examples of how that plays out. So I don't know. I couldn't remember if that was, what does it look like to have a social tipping point, if there has been literature showing that, and then what about climate and energy either fits that or doesn't?
Can I put an example in there from the energy space?
Yeah.
The biggest change that's occurred, but certainly in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in the last 20 years or so, was the collapse in the price of natural gas. And that occurred because of hydrofracking and horizontal drilling all of a sudden became commercially available. And a lot of people, that fits a lot of people's mental model of all of a sudden some genius discovers something and it changes the world. And my God, it was to the benefit, or at least people thought for a while, until they discovered the magnitude of the leaks, that it was a big change, a big benefit for dealing with greenhouse gases. Now, the reality is the US federal government poured hundreds of millions of dollars into hydrofracking,
Right.
Going back 40, 50 years. And the idea that some one genius could come up with something, his name was George Mitchell, all of a sudden, instead, it's the end of a long process, right, which, by the way, has government involvement, which is another thing some of these people like to forget. And, that's a much more complicated and interesting story about social change than somebody came up with a brilliant idea. Whoosh, this is the way the world works. I think we get a lot of delusional ideas that way, ideas of how the world changes, and we need a much more subtle understanding.
Yeah, and another example I want to show is, there's been a lot of climate protests the last few years. Extinction Rebellion in the UK, they were credited to a certain extent with some little change, but then you have these counter movements, like the Yellow Vests in France and the farmers rising up over issues. This gets to what I was saying about there's not one single dimension to this. It's not like climate activists suddenly rule the world. When you have constraints, you have a real dynamic, multidimensional landscape of responses. So I think that gets missed by some of those pushing the rhetoric around something like climate emergency, which we've also talked a little bit about. And in this case, the tipping point concept being applicable in the social sphere. Elisabeth at Carleton University.
Thank you. Yeah, when we were formulating this paper together, it was actually one of our concerns and one of the things that we have heard back by fewer people than we had originally thought. But people sort of pushed back and said, don't you understand the urgency, right? That by being a bit critical about tipping points, some felt that it was sort of, intentionally trying to underplay these emergencies or the sense of crisis, right? So again, really reflecting upon the language. And I think, obviously, we're, in no way, right? There is more than enough evidence about why we need to mitigate, why we need to adapt. But I think the tipping point framing, I think it does sort of focus in on sort of, in some ways, not allowing enough entry points for these different perspectives. And in doing so, it focuses everyone on having one understanding, where we know that there can be multiple valid perspectives, not about climate change, but about the nature of the solutions that are in front of us. And so I think in some ways for myself, this was also a call to the scientific community to refocus on sort of actionable insights, right? Ones that really bring in real world decision making, focus on the governance needs. And so we have well-founded risks on which we can focus today. And I think finding spaces for people around that would represent a really important contribution, something for the scientific and the policy community to come into dialogue on. And so I think it just comes back to that idea that the tipping point framing, to the extent that it's capturing high uncertainty, high impact risks, is important, but taken as a whole can really limit what is what sort of actions can be conceptualized. And so really, the paper was written with the idea of saying, in fact, we actually are calling for action. We just believe that if we have that we need to sort of very carefully consider where we're putting that focus.
For sure. Now, as I said earlier, back in 2006, Gavin Schmidt, who now runs Goddard Institute, NASA, had posted something that feels like a curtain raiser for your work. He wonders if anyone else has noticed that we appear to have crossed a threshold in the usage of this phrase. And he basically articulates that if you have multiple dimensions of tipping points with deep uncertainty, you end up with rising risk, which takes us back to what we were saying with Michael earlier and Bob. Was there something you found that takes this beyond those points that were there at that time? And by the way, I wrote about this at that time a lot too in the Times, but then the surge of tipping point coverage just kept building. You know, Kate Yoder did a good piece on your paper, but if you go on Google News search for GRIST, it's like another climate tipping point to worry about: plankton, the 7 climate tipping points that could change the world, how the world's coral reefs have they already crossed the tipping point. So are we running up an accelerating down escalator here, or I don't want to bum you out too much, but and you've staked your points. So back to Bob a little bit on that. You know,
I mean, I guess I'd say, you know, one of the things that have changed in the last 20 years is we now have this 1.5 degree target that we're going to go over,
right.
And people have confused that with a tipping point, and that's a natural thing to do given the things. Like given the framing, and I'm going to say, like, this is sort of perhaps a trap that was originally in the framing. Like the early work was pretty careful about trying to distinguish, you know, not use the term tipping point as like focus on, but instead terms like tipping element. And like I could see, okay, yeah, there are elements of the Earth system prone to feedback-driven state shifts, okay. But because the whole framing was spawned out of Malcolm Gladwell's popularization, there's this like gravitational attraction to these oversimplifications that go back to Gladwell. And I think it's you know, a bunch of scientists saying, no, we're trying to be very precise about it. I like that they're the ones who in some ways are going the wrong way down the escalator. So I think if we don't do something about it, you know, we're going to cross 1.5 degrees C. People are going to realize it's not a tipping point, and that you know, things are going to come to a head that way. I also, and this will actually get a little bit at the Rockstrom question that just popped up. Then this is, you know, this is going beyond the paper to my sort of reflections. But you know, there are a lot of academics who would like the world to be simple. Right. So the starting point for this is like, you know, we would love to be able to model climate policy as a single global carbon price, right? Going back to Nordhaus. Right. We would love to say, okay, there are a few warning lights on the Earth system and they're going to be blinking, and then we're going to do something as like a global society acting as a unified actor under the advice of these very enlightened Earth system scientists. Planetary boundaries is very much akin to this as well. Yes. But that's not the world we live in. We live in a big, messy world with a lot of values and a little perspective at stake. And climate touches so many of those things we value, and it's important to act on. But it's not, for most people, it's not actually the thing they care about most, right? I care about climate change because of its impact on my children, because of its impact on my housing, because of its impact on my food supply, right? And so it's important to deal with those, but that's not like the console of warning lights for Starship Earth. That is how policy gets made. So
old, right?
I think there's a little bit of a you know, climate science first attitude embedded in some of these perspectives that are the reverse, I think, of real world decision making, where climate science needs to inform decisions where those decisions are being made.
Yeah. On the other hand, let me say something. The origin of this, partly, and Bob, you and I had an argument about this when the paper was being drafted, was that early on there wasn't much about the climate problem on the impact side that could be said. And one of the few things, in fact, if you go back and look in the literature, the first thing that was noted as a possible benchmark for how much warming is too much was the potential serious degradation and demise of coral reef systems. And that happened, or that showed up on people's radar, because El Nino years, all of a sudden, with the help of a half a degree or so of human-induced warming, were pushing many coral reefs into a situation of mass bleaching. very widespread bleaching. Bleaching had happened before for other reasons. All of a sudden, it became sort of a tropic-wide phenomenon. And the so-called safety range, it's not a transition that happens over 3, 4, 5 degrees. Over a small change in temperature, a lot of the Earth's coral reef all of a sudden was at risk. They didn't all die right away, but they got into a condition where they needed some time to recover. And as those temperatures get closer and closer together in occurrence, some of these reefs will start not to recover. And that became a benchmark in some people's mind. You can look that up and you'll see it as an early, sorry, my phone is going.
That's okay.
As an early feature, which people started using as, well, maybe this is one thing that dangerous interference with the climate system could be interpreted as meaning. So there was a motivation behind looking for simple, as Bob says, and notice big things that are simple, could be identified and could be threatening enough that global policy could be hung on them. And that's also why the what was then called the thermohaline circulation, the AMOC, was looked at carefully, and also the ice sheets. But over time, it just got diffused much too wide. And now that we know a lot more about each of those systems, in most cases, it's not a very good idea to talk about them as tipping points.
Exactly.
But,
I was going to bring that point up because actually, Michael, I think long time ago, you wrote a paper with someone that had the phrase negative learning in it.
Yeah, that was right.
And where, society presumes more science, the next IPCC report will get us closer to this magical solution set for climate change. When in fact, when you look at coral reefs, and even in recent years, the papers are about, even along the barrier reef in Australia, there's areas that are thriving and areas that are dying. And you look at mountain ecosystems, and it turns out they're very variegated. And so the species aren't just sort of vanishing up the top of the mountain. Right. And that's in every arena. And that all cuts again against this idea of precision. The idea
it's a complicated problem. And the more you know, the harder it is to characterize it with simple statements. On the other hand, we know a lot about the larger frame of the problem. And I don't want to say, that it's so complicated we can't make some very direct statements. We do, and we have to be careful about what we say.
Yeah, but scientists are people too, and they like funding, and they like when the IPCC gets a Nobel Prize, and that the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC. I'd like to ask you if you think that was particularly damaging in a way in amplifying this arena. But I want to show you back to the World Economic Forum. This is on one of their websites, and this conveys exactly what Bob was talking about. This is on a website they had put up for the last Davos thing. Just watch for a second. It's this dream vision of the world of scientists looking. It blows my mind. I just found this just before the show. Just watch. And here we are, the air traffic controllers for the world. So this is how the world of high finance and Davos-ish thinking is interpreted. It's pretty disturbing. I'm sure that was on some stage.
So I would love Liz in particular to chime in on this, but I also think it made me think of this, makes you think, well, why is it that tipping points really is a global north thing in climate discourse, right? It's not something that people who are experiencing most of the damages from real existing climate change are spending a lot of their time worrying about. And like Liz is involved in international negotiations, so I'd love you to.
Well, I mean, I think I can also just bring this back to some of the working group 2 perspectives, where some of the the ways in which different parts of the scientific community sort of take up these ideas. And a lot of, especially the negative social tipping point type literature, it has a sort of nature of kind of, this is sort of like othering, right? It happens somewhere else where, people can't, they will just sort of somehow, without even thinking about it, will sort of fall into these states of chaos. And I think those who are very used to being othered in these processes sort of reflect upon it and say that that's not their reality. They adapt, they have resilience, they keep going, right? Who are you talking about when you start to imagine the, like, what are we reifying and why? And I think some of that really came out in some of the working group 2 conversations around this. And I think in ways that, again, kind of move us away from thinking about actionable solutions for people who need them now. And in fact, I mean, even if we sort of think, oh, this is, relatively benign or well-meaning, it actually can have the impact of sort of pushing this out in time, in fact, rather than focusing on exactly what's needed now for people who know much better than those of us in the global north what it looks like to live in a climate change world. And so I think I'd sort of, reflect, and we reflect upon this a bit in the paper, but we've been thinking much more about some of those implications of negative social tipping points and positive social tipping points in terms of what are they doing for us, right? So, really trying to take a much more critical lens. And I think it's the same with positive tipping points, right? It's really taking the resources away from what is some very hard and systematic work on governance and global cooperation that is needed.
I want to show getting that those points are really important. And, I should draw in some developing country scientists for a future conversation on this and on that question of opportunity cost, which has come up, when the scientific community is focusing too much on the grand scale, they're missing the vulnerability reduction science. Lisa Schipper and that whole chunk of the IPCC, I've had her on here multiple times, and scientists from Madagascar and elsewhere. The one thing in getting back to tipping points and alternatives, tipping elements within the system, I kind of think is promising, Bob, because it's more realistic.
I would stay away from the term tipping in general, because I think once you use it, you're going to end up back at tipping.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. I do want to hark back to way back, Steve Pacala, when I was writing about the wedges, solutions to climate. He talked about the monsters behind the door. And when I was putting together the show, I had to go back to the 1922 movie Nosferatu to illustrate his concept. In other words, I would think when you have scientific basis for big consequential things, moving in one direction, it takes you toward more risk, and another direction takes you away from risk. It feels like we understand that notion, whether we've done it with asteroid deflection. I've been writing about the asteroid strike issue for 20 years. And we're moving toward in good directions on that one, and we don't know when the next big asteroid is going to hit. We do know we need better scoping of parts of the sky, etc. So can we just get comfortable with monsters behind the door, I guess, is the question.
Well, so it would be more, I'd like to be more, right? I mean, so with asteroids, right, there are specific investments one would make as part of a risk management strategy, like knowing where they are, that one wouldn't make if you weren't concerned about them. I think one of the fundamental things about tipping points is people haven't been very clear about what it is they want us to do about tipping points that we ought not to be doing because people are flooding and drowning and dying in heat waves already. And when you push on this, most of those folks say, well, we need to mitigate, right? Well, we need to mitigate anyways. And then some people, and I just saw the UK had a RFP this year that made this this year that made this connection between tipping points and geoengineering. Some people say, oh, well, that tipping points very specifically is a reason to do geoengineering. And like, I am not 100% against geoengineering in all circumstances, but I'm 100% against geoengineering to avoid arbitrary things that don't actually exist.
Right.
And beyond that, and much of like the Global Tipping Points report is quite clear, they're against geoengineering, right? So then, okay, what besides the thing we ought already to be doing is the actionable thing that come out of this literature and out of this approach. And I think, like, again, it sort of comes from the science first approach, but this is ultimate, say, choosing to frame things as tipping points as opposed to potential surprises, as opposed to feedback driven state shifts, is not a scientific choice. It is a communication choice, and I think that choice ought to be driven in substantial part by the implications of that choice. And if you can't tell me what you're going to do differently by using this charismatic phrase that you wouldn't do by using a more precise phrase, why are we doing it? Like, it sort of made sense maybe when there weren't a lot of focusing events about climate change, but like, the reason why climate policy isn't advancing fast enough right now is not the lack of focusing events, right? It's some other part of the political economy, and that this framing adds confusion and doesn't do anything to address that.
So if I could organize a future webcast with Tim Linton in it, and do you sense that we can get some productive outcome, or is it too embedded and too hard to disentangle?
Could have an interesting. I think Tim and I are on another paper together, not about tipping points. Like, we both agree that it's really important to study the dynamics of how risk propagates through macroeconomic systems and governance from climate risk, right? So that, like, there's a lot of points of agreement there, right? It's like, I think the tipping points work is fundamentally a communications work, and it's gotten ahead of the fact, the scholarly basis for saying it's a useful communication work.
It should also be remembered that in the climate system, there are some things that do tip, and where the term is appropriately applied. The classic case was the collapse of the Larsen B ice shelf. Wham! In 6 weeks, this gigantic chunk of ice disappeared. It changed the dynamics of the ice in back of it. And luckily, it happens to be on the Antarctic Peninsula, where there isn't a lot of ice in back of it. So sea level didn't rise a lot as a result. If they would focus on those things, which are dramatic but not earth-shaking so far, it might produce not only a more accurate picture for the public for what happens in one case and not the other, but also it might produce some additional science that we're not getting because people are too busy chasing things which really they may be important scientifically, but they're they're getting an excessive amount of attention because of this particular framing. And I think actually scientifically there are things that are getting too much attention because of the framing.
And I say, like, I think most of the things under this banner are important to study, but I think there's actually there's a cost and not, to me, a clear benefit of trying to use the same framing to talk about collapse of social norms and collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. Like that, there's an attempt to fuse these together and accumulate knowledge across them, and that seems like that strikes me as a somewhat not incredibly costly, but it's a cost because it takes time, and I do not understand what the benefit is of it.
Yeah, except that, as someone said earlier, for the Northern Hemisphere wealthy world, I think there's still a dominant view of a mechanistic approach, splitting it into pieces and getting technologies into place for the emissions reduction. And they're really negating the risk reduction, which is about vulnerability reduction in places that matter. And that's like the antithesis of a tipping thing. I've talked to all my disaster research friends about the pressure model for disaster. We pay attention to the moment of the disaster, but the pressure model, Ben Wissner and others, it's this cumulative set of forcings on society: poverty, dislocation, marginalization, underinvestment, and social networks. And then you have the thing, and we think about the thing, but not about all that stuff. But how do you make that into a story? How do you make that into a shiny website? How do you make that into an IPCC special report? Well, there was the special report on disasters was really
great, and it was the best report IPCC ever put out, in my view, and it was extremely valuable to people trying to understand how you import some of our understanding of disasters into climate change and vice versa. Yeah. And it led both communities to being better off. And it's the most important reference point I've had in my work for the last 12 years since it came out. And I also, you asked me about the 1.5 degree report. I think it did an important service. The service was maybe not the one that people were looking for, but maybe unexpectedly, maybe some people were calculating that this would happen. It drew out a tremendous research effort, which has attempted to define and refine the notion of what happens to risk as temperature increases in this relatively low range, which not a lot of people had been looking at. They've been looking at 3 degrees and above, and turns out there's quite a difference between, in some cases, 1.5 to 2.5, and that's where we are right now. So it's impact work that we wanted, that we needed. Yeah. And you could worry about what ultimately that'll be turned into in terms of public policy and the maybe misconstruing of the 1.5 degree target, but we're much better off for having that research having been done.
Yeah. Sorry, I'd like to have each of you kind of do a summary next steps statement, and I'll certainly be reaching out to maybe Rockstrom and Lenton and see if we can build some cross-cutting conversations going forward.
But by the way, one person to talk to us is Ricardo Winkelmann, who is now head of a center at the University of Göttingen, maybe, which I think has tipping in the title. I had a conversation with her 2 weeks ago, and she's well aware of these complexities and would be a good person to include.
Good. And anyway, let's just go up the chain here. And Bob, I might leave you for the last word, but Elisabeth and then Rachael, where do we go from here? Who needs to be in the discussion going forward so you're sleeping better at night about this?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, to me, I think one of the big take homes here, and the thing that I would sort of say should be one of our next steps, is to really, instead of thinking about these ideas that there's sort of these quick wins in climate policy, is really to think about the long-term investments. Yes, we want to see adoption of renewable energy. Yes, we'd like to see it much faster. But I think it's that call to really focus on economic and social inequities, bringing in more voices. Global climate policy is resilience. And so I think this paper starts a bit of that dialogue, trying to move away from being so hazard focused, and thinking a lot more foundationally about what some of the next important, impactful steps would be. And I think it is framing that moves us away from tipping points.
And Elisabeth? Oh, sorry, that was Elisabeth. Rachael.
I think, this points me to thinking about the role of social science, and particularly in its interaction with uncertainty, or what we can predict and say about the future of social demographics and the political system. What we can say about that.
Yeah.
Sorry, dogs and kids coming home.
No.
And so, yeah, I've been thinking a lot more about what the contributions of social science are around understanding how society is going to evolve and adapt, and kind of the uncertainty around the social science predictions or knowledges.
There's that uncertainty word again, though, which, I've done many shows, including with the Society for Decision Making under Deep Uncertainty, about how to actualize and add a dynamic for dealing with uncertainty in this kind of issues in ways that stick and persist, and tough challenges going forward. So Bob, congratulations on pulling together, you with the others, pulling together a very valuable paper. I'll be doing what I can to, amplify and spread it around, and including on Blue Sky, even though someone put me on a ban list on Blue Sky, a denier and troll list, which is pretty discouraging. It's still a good place. So where do we go, man? What's your
So is what we think we have in common with the people who are advocating for tipping points. Like, I think we all agree that it's important to think about potential surprises from the Earth systems and from social systems. But we think that should be, in the IPCC world, we think that should be an important part of the 7th assessment report. I personally am very concerned with how risk propagates through social systems, right? And so, like, what makes our macroeconomy and what makes our governance system resilient to shocks? Because we are creating a lot more shocks through climate change, and those are of a family of things. The pandemic also was a major shock, and one arguably, like, our governance systems are still having some difficulty recovering from that large scale shock. Well, we're going to see a lot more of these shocks, and so I think studying what are the dynamics that determine the fragility or resilience of complex systems, particularly social systems that have things we care about in them, is another important area, and I think Tim Linden and others would agree with that. I also think that when we pick charismatic terms as scientists to communicate, and they are successful in getting people's attention, and there's no question tipping points are good at getting attention, we need to subject those choices to science. So I would like, we have some small scale evidence and some anecdotal evidence that the tipping points framing creates confusion, that it can create despair, that is not necessarily productive to climate action. But I think I would love to see more explicit research on that topic as well. And if we move towards alternative framings, then those alternative framings also should be things that we listen, we get input from social scientists on, and don't just rely on our own intuitions as climate scientists about what is and isn't an effective communications term. It's easy to see whether a term is effective at getting attention. It's less easy to see some of these more complex implications until it's had longer term to frame out. And then the other thing is, I think we all need to be crystal clear that 1.5 degrees is a policy milestone. It's a policy milestone that was basically set to reflect the fact that there's a lot of bad things that happen between now and 2 degrees C that we're already experiencing, and not that it's a particularly salient milestone of the physical property of the climate system itself.
Well, this is great. Thanks everyone for joining in today on a Friday, right after AGU, et cetera. So this was a really useful initial discussion of this questions raised by this important paper, Tipping Points Confuse and Can Distract from Urgent Climate Action in Nature Climate Change. Robert Kopp, Elisabeth Gilmore, Rachael Shwom, and here Michael Oppenheimer, and there was a number of other authors. I encourage people to look up the paper. It has gotten a couple of headlines. So there's a news release from Rutgers. Grist and Scientific American have run stories. But then the rest of if I put in tipping points and climate in Google News, the rest is how close are we? 11 climate tipping points. et cetera, et cetera. So there's work to be done by the media and by people like me here too. This is Andy Revkin. This is another really interesting Sustained What episode. As soon as we're done, you can share this with others at the various on platforms, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and yes, X, Twitter, and even on Blue Sky. So let's do this again. Really appreciate your time. And hold on one second.